Hello, I'm here. I didn't forget. Um, I wanted to start by thanking all the people who have gotten so upset that I am back on YouTube and that Negs is back on YouTube. People who take this so personally that they have been melting down on their channels and tweeting nonstop, which has pushed our sub count over 600. So I want to thank everybody for giving us the leg up. You guys are amazing. What a great street team we have. So thank you. Thank you, everybody. Hello, my darling. Hello, Dee. So this is a late one. I wasn't going to stream it all today. I was feeling very grumpy earlier. Hello, Anna. Um, yeah, it is free. Free publicity. Isn't that amazing? I wasn't going to stream it all today because it was very hot today and I had a lot to do today. And so I told Nags I'm not streaming. You go ahead. And then I changed my mind because I cooled down. I drank some water. I got over myself and thought, okay, I'll do a late evening stream. And whoever shows up, shows up. And the people who don't show up can catch it on the replay. So I am going to talk about a subject today that means a great deal to me and has meant a great deal to me for years. And the reason that I'm doing this today, it's a funny reason. A few months ago, another YouTuber, whose name I will not mention because I do not want to bring my channel down to that level, hosted a panel where they talked about Chantal and the very exploitative relationship that she had with a 40-year-old man when she was 16. And this particular YouTuber was using every trope imaginable that sexists use and that apologists use for child groomers by saying, well, Chantal was couch surfing and she was kind of wild and she was kind of out of control. And so ... right? And I took exception to that and I live streamed about it. And in the live stream, I said that exact attitude is what enabled the grooming gangs in the UK to get away with exploiting so many girls for decades. And of course, this person who can't take criticism got very upset and started throwing out all their bona fides about all the women and the girls they've worked with and the youth that they've counseled. Well, that's a funny kind of advocacy work that you do. And if you've ever counseled a single teenager, because she was saying, oh, yeah, well, I've dealt with a lot of wild teenage girls. Again, repeating the same tropes, the same lines that were used to avoid prosecution of these grooming gangs and allowed these gangs to flourish and allowed more and more and more girls to be exploited. So as I said, this is a topic that means a great deal to me. I'm not using it to take a dig at anyone. I'm not using it to get a gotcha. I'm doing it because I give a shit about it. And I have, like I said, for years. And I thought, how in the world am I going to approach this? Because it's a big story. And I've seen that recently there's been a lot of revisionist history because of the social unrest that you've seen lately in the UK. And people are coming out now to talk about, try to rewrite history about what happened with these grooming gangs. And I saw this on Twitter and I saw interviews on British TV. And I thought, oh, no, we're not going to do this. No, we're not doing this. So I thought, how am I going to cover it? And I found an interview with one of the bravest women in the UK. And this woman had an inside perspective. Hello, Love Life. She had an inside view, an inside perspective on what actually happened. And she is very much in a position to give her expert opinion and give a genuine look at why these grooming gangs were allowed to flourish, why the prison sentences were so light, why there are people who were meant to be deported years ago who are still in the UK to this day. So I thought we might listen to this interview and take it all in. Hi, IDGAF. I appreciate it. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate all of you being here. What am I talking about? All right, so let's bring this up. This is on Andrew Gold's channel. No, it's not the Andrew Gold who sang Lonely Boy back in the 70s. This is another Andrew Gold who decided to close down his regular YouTube channel where he covered cults, primarily covered cults, and started a channel called Heretics where he interviews people with opinions that go against the grain. And it's a fantastic channel. He's interviewed some great people, very interesting. And he's a professional journalist, so he knows how to interview people. So I thought that we would watch this together. The video is called "Expose the Sick Gangs Worse Than Epstein." Absolutely, much worse than Jeffrey Epstein, because there were so many victims. So many victims, so young. And it was the way that the victims were treated by the establishment that is the absolute disgrace here. That is the real story. So let's watch this remarkable woman, Maggie Oliver, and learn something today.
Tell me a little bit, just for those who don't know, about your background and the Rochdale gangs.
How long have you got?
We've got an hour.
I just always describe myself as an ordinary woman. You know, I've got 4 kids. I was married. I joined the police when I was 41. So I was an older recruit, if you like. And I think that's probably what made me different, that I had a very, some would say, overdeveloped sense of what was right and what was wrong.
Yep.
But when I'd got a kind of a rich life before I joined the police. I traveled a lot. I went back to university when I was 37. I was quite confident, but I believed that when I joined the police, I was joining to make a difference, to do the right thing, to protect the vulnerable. And when every police officer swears an oath of attestation, and in that oath, you promise that you will uphold the law, that you will protect the vulnerable, you will do it to the best of your ability. And really, that's what I thought I was doing. And I was in the police for 16 years. And it was only really my first concerns were when I worked on a case in Manchester in 2004 and 5, where I saw 100 men who had abused dozens of children, that we knew their identities, their car regs, their phone numbers, and about 3 dozen children, most of those living in care homes, from the age of 11 up to about 15. And we had a big operation called Operation Augusta. And I worked in it for about a year and a half. But my husband was terminally ill, and I went off work he died in July 2005. I went off maybe 6 weeks before he died. And when I came back to work after he died, that whole job had just been buried, completely died a death as though it had never existed.
Yep,
and I
interesting.
couldn't understand how that could happen. But I had no paperwork. I'd got, 4 young children, 2 still at school. I was in a mess. I'd been with my husband for 30 years. And so I tried to get answers, but I hit a brick wall, really. And uncomfortable as it was, there was little I could do because I didn't have any paperwork. I didn't have any evidence. The computer system had been closed down. So it was my voice against the machine, if you like.
Yep.
But I worked, I didn't work in child protection, Andrew. I worked in serious crime. I worked in the major incident team. So I went back to my normal duties. I worked on gang-related murders and shootings. I did kidnappings, witness protection. I loved my job, and I was really good with vulnerable people. And so 5 years later, I was approached and asked to go on a job in Rochdale, which was identical to the job in Manchester in 2005. And the drama Three Girls kind of covers this a little bit, but I told them I wasn't interested. Yeah, I wasn't putting myself through that again, where I...
That's the BBC drama for the people outside of Britain. Might not know it.
Yeah, there
Three
was
Girls.
a BBC drama ultimately commissioned that we won 6 BAFTAs. I think it's back on iPlayer now. You can watch it again.
You were played.
I was played by Leslie Sharp. Yeah. And that drama actually very clearly explains what child sexual exploitation is. It explains what grooming gangs do.
Yep.
What it didn't do was focus on the failures of the police, on the Crown Prosecution Service, on what I would consider corruption and gross criminal neglect.
And I want to point out that this scandal did not just occur in a couple of cities. At the last count, there were 100 cities up and down the UK that had grooming gangs in them, where these men got away with the most grotesque and heinous crimes against young girls. And there's been a lot made of the fact that so many of the victims were poor and white. They were white working class girls and considered expendable. But we also need to consider that the Sikh and the Hindu communities in the UK had been crying out for justice for years because girls in those communities were being targeted as well. And those girls haven't gotten the attention that they should get, quite frankly. You're going to hear a lot about Asian grooming gangs. You saw that in the thumbnail. This is a euphemism that the British press has adopted to, instead of saying the word Pakistani, they say Asian. And this has upset other members of the actual Asian community, the Japanese, the Vietnamese, the Chinese. It's very much pissed off the Sikhs and the Hindus, the Indians, who have nothing to do with this and don't appreciate being sort of roped in with what was primarily a Pakistani Muslim problem in the UK. So when you see people rioting, for example, in Rochdale and Rotherham, and you think, well, what's going on here? What's all this about two-tier policing? This was one of the biggest scandals in the United Kingdom in the 20th century. And this is exactly what we're talking about when we talk about two-tier policing. So let's continue.
Within the agencies that are meant to protect children. So if I roll back to the start of that job, it became known as Operation Span, and I was asked to join it. Now, I was approached, and the first thing I was told was that there'd been a routine property review in Greater Manchester Police property system, and a fetus had been found. And that had been seized 2 years previously from a little girl who had been just 13 when she was made pregnant. She didn't know that the police had seized it. They'd never told her. They'd never told her mum. They'd not had any consent. And yet they knew that she was being sexually abused by a gang of men. They needed DNA from that to prove who had made her pregnant. So because of my skills with vulnerable people, I was asked to go on to that job to bring on board not only that little girl who was called Ruby, that's her alias. Okay. That's what she was referred to in the drama, Three Girls. Would I approach Ruby and her family, tell them that we had a fetus, keep them on side and ask the family, would they cooperate with an investigation and help us to prosecute the abusers.
If you haven't seen the drama that she's talking about, it's called Three Girls. It was a BBC production. It's very, very good. It's difficult to watch, but it's very, very good. And I highly, highly recommend it. If you can track it down, Three Girls, watch it because it's an excellent drama.
So that was a big ask because that family wouldn't even let a police officer through the door. And that was because 2 years previously, they had already spoken to the police and social services. They didn't know about the fetus being seized, but Ruby's sister was called Amber. And as a 14, 15-year-old child, she too had been horrendously abused. But then at the age of 15, she was accused of being some kind of a madam and had been arrested. Nothing had come of it, but it had terrified her. And I was asked to also gain her trust and ask her whether she would support a police prosecution.
This was part of the problem, is that a number of these girls were accused of being prostitutes. These girls largely came from poor families, working class families, troubled families, or they were in the foster care system. And so they were characterized by the police and by the British press as prostitutes. We're talking about girls as young as 11. So one has to ask, how is it that girls who were so far below the age of consent were not allowed, that's probably the wrong word. Why wasn't there a more of an alarm set off about such young girls being trafficked and raped the way they were for so many years by men who had been identified? Okay, it was not a mystery who these men were. This wasn't some shady ring of, Albanians or something that were untraceable and unknown to the authorities. The authorities knew who these men were and did nothing about it. Let's continue.
So because of my experiences earlier, I was not prepared to go on that job. But I was given cast iron guarantees that if I brought these kids on board, that there would not be a repeat of Operation Augusta, that they would be supported right the way through to court, and that I would be allowed to support them. And alongside that, I was given official policy documents documenting those promises. In relation to Amber, also the top lawyer in the Crown Prosecution Service had assessed why she'd been arrested. It took 2 months, actually. And at the end of that period of time, he said she should never have been arrested. She is a victim.
Of course.
In the same way as all the other children. And with those guarantees, I agreed to go on that job.
Is it worth mentioning at this point that I believe it was these gangs were 99% British Pakistani?
Yes, it is worth mentioning.
There were 99% British Pakistani Muslim men.
Right.
There were one or two, like Afghanistani. But at that point in time, nobody would speak about that.
99% Pakistani Muslim. I insist that from now on, if we are going to discuss this matter honestly, and we are going to talk about things as they actually occurred, we must include the statistic 99% British Pakistani. I don't want to hear this word Asian, this weasel word that the press used to avoid charges or accusations of racism or whatever. 99% Pakistani. This is coming from a woman who was involved in the investigation. Let's continue.
Because it was it was a very uncomfortable truth. And I don't think we talk about it very much now, but I do think that there is an acceptance. I don't think it can be avoided anymore, that this particular kind of sexual crime, grooming gangs, is predominantly Pakistani Muslim men.
Mhm.
Now, I hear them frequently referred to as Asian grooming gangs, but I know that that's not true.
Of
You know, they're
course
not
not.
from Thailand.
No.
They're not
Right.
Sikhs. They're not Hindus.
Right.
They're not from Japan. You know, they are predominantly Pakistani Muslim men.
Mhm.
So, I mean, even this last week, I've had an email from a Sikh man saying that that community are really upset that these gangs are referred to as Asian.
Of course.
But the authorities tiptoed around that fact. And I do think that was one of the reasons why this problem was allowed to evolve and go unchallenged for perhaps 20 years, if I'm honest. But my take on that always is that for me, this has always been about protecting children.
Of course.
And I don't care where an abuser comes from. You know, I don't care if it's Jeffrey Epstein or Harvey Weinstein or
Mhm.
a priest in the Catholic Church. The law in this country says you cannot have 40, 50, 60-year-old man cannot get a child of 11, 12, 13 drunk out of their head and then have sex with them. That is rape. And the law says that is unlawful. So for me, it was simple. We had the evidence. I mean, even with Ruby, we had a fetus. We proved who had got her pregnant. Ruby had special educational needs. She had the mental capacity of a younger child. And she gave multiple interviews on video to me, naming multiple abusers. At the end of the road, even in relation to Ruby, that man was never charged with rape. He was charged with conspiracy.
Oh,
He was out of prison in less than 4 years.
wow.
Ruby didn't know he hadn't been charged with rape. He was allowed to go back to Rochdale where these crimes were happening. And she bumped into him in the local supermarket, not even knowing he was out of prison.
Imagine.
So those things really made me angry, made me ashamed to be a police officer. And it was the second time I'd seen this happen. And I thought, you know, it made me very, very ill, actually, because I couldn't make any sense of it. You know, for me, it was simple. You had it.
Correct.
If you just simplify it to Ruby, because your listeners, I can't go into everything.
Sure.
It's really complicated. But I did write a book called Survivors. So if anybody really wants to understand the full complexities of it, it's all written down in there.
Mm.
And, you know, Donna, I saw a very good and very sensible YouTube video. There's a British barrister who has a YouTube channel. And he did, I think, a very fair minded explanation of why it is that a lot of the people who were arrested, and this includes a child, by the way, I think a 12-year-old was arrested after the unrest in the UK. And he explained why it was that some of these people received such long sentences. And one of the things that he said was, you know, some of these people did not have clean records. They weren't just, uh, angry keyboard warriors pounding out a furious tweet on a whim, and the police barged down, broke their door down. Okay, they were people who had previous convictions for XYZ, long sheets of arrests and all that. Be that as it may, I don't think a 12-year-old has a long rap sheet. That is just my guess. And there is no question that in recent years that the police in the UK have moved away from this type of police work and focused more on social media, which is one of the reasons why we should be so grateful that we have the First Amendment in this country. And those of us, those people who take the First Amendment for granted do not understand what it is like to live in a country without one, because that's the kind of thing that happens. You go on the internet or you make a YouTube video saying that a man cannot become a woman and vice versa. And the next thing you know, a SWAT team is at your door, putting your whole family on the floor and putting a gun to your head. This is true. This has happened in the UK, mostly to women. And so when two-tier Keir decided to go out and talk about, how the extreme right was responsible for all the violence, you had a lot of gender critical women go on Twitter and say, well, I guess I'm extreme right too. Because for years, you in the government allowed Antifa, violent trans rights activists, and politicians to target women who were out there saying, we want our own spaces, brutalizing them, beating them up, arresting them, dragging them off to jail. And so there's another example of the two-tier police structure in the UK. You had Sikhs, you had Hindus, you had Blacks, you had a lot of people come out and say, okay, I guess I'm extreme right wing too. I think there was probably even a hashtag. So this two-tier policing issue does not just apply to the grooming gangs or to the people who were just dragged into the dock over Facebook posts. It also applies to gender critical women and basically people who said no to the system. It's very, very serious. But in terms of modern roots, all you have to do is go to Rochdale, Rotherham, all these other cities where these grooming leads, these cities where these grooming gangs were allowed to flourish, the cover-ups, and that scandal involving the Crown Prosecution Service, the press, the politicians, and the police.
Well, briefly, should we just say roughly how many children were involved in this Rochdale grooming gangs?
Thank
Countless.
you, tell you.
But 2 weeks ago, there was an independent report published, which has taken 12 years to come out. I've worked with an independent review team for 6 years. That report 2 weeks ago officially found that there were almost 100 abusers again, that there were in excess of, I think they said 76 children. And yet eventually there was a trial built around one child. That for me is not justice. We had the evidence, we had the children. The official findings of that report was that Greater Manchester Police were not prepared to put resources into that investigation. And that was the same reasoning that was given about the 2005 job in the official report that reported in 2020. So both of those reports I could have written 15, 20 years ago. Well, 15 years and 12 years ago, because there is nothing in those reports that I wasn't saying at the time. And in relation to the Rochdale case, my final day on that job, it was on a Friday afternoon. There was a meeting. The first time the barrister had been in to see us, I wasn't invited into that meeting.
Of course
that
not.
Amber had, as I say, had just identified 10 of the first 12 of her abusers. She had put her life on the line for 8 months. We were delivering precisely what senior officers at Greater Manchester Police had asked me to do. And they came out of that meeting, and I was told by a colleague, have they said anything to you, Maggie? No. Right. Well, they're not going to use Amber anymore. Now, this was the second time I'd heard it, and this time I'd been given cast iron guarantees that if these kids told me and told the police what had happened to them, that they would be supported all the way through to trial. And here I am being told again, we've changed our mind. And I literally picked my bag up because I would have punched somebody. I was incandescent with rage. I was angry. I was incredulous. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. and I walked off that job and I never went back on it. Now, in relation to Amber, bear in mind the top lawyer in the CPS had decided that she was a victim, even though she'd been arrested before we were allowed to.
The CPS in the UK is short for the Crown Prosecution Service. It's not our CPS. Their CPS is different.
To even go anywhere near her. They had officially designated her a victim. I left that job. I sat at home trying to think, what am I going to do? Because at that point, I honestly believed it was a lazy officer who wasn't doing the job. I was just so naive. I really, really thought I never for one moment thought that the whole organization, that the whole of police in the UK had made a conscious decision that this is how these cases would be dealt with.
That's right.
I mean, the last 12 years have been an education for me.
So what's behind this? Are we dealing with people who are sort of afraid of offending minorities, or are we dealing with potentially people who are friends with the bad people who are infiltrating the police?
Both those two official reports have said that the police dropped both those jobs because they would not put resources into it. So it was money. So it's about prioritizing the resources within the police force. But I have no doubt that part of that was a judgment of these children, that they were from difficult backgrounds.
That's
that
right.
They were. I mean, how many times have you heard that these children were making a lifestyle choice, that they were complicit in their abuse? And my response to that,
A lifestyle choice, and that they were complicit in their abuse. This is exactly why I got so upset when I heard what was said on that panel about Chantal. And this is exactly why I called out that particular content creator, because those words were used to dismiss what had happened to Chantal when she was a teenager. I felt a certain type of way about that because I knew that the same thing had happened in the UK to these young girls. And there were thousands of victims, thousands. This scandal went on for decades, thousands of victims. Imagine concluding that an 11-year-old made a lifestyle choice. And fun fact, I first discovered Tommy Robinson when Dave Rubin had him on. I think this was in 2016, in the very, very early days of the Rubin Report. And Tommy Robinson was the first person I heard talking about this scandal, but in a very blunt way, not holding anything back. Tommy Robinson is from Luton. And in Luton, there was a terrible problem. And so I know people do not like him. I know he's a very divisive figure. I know that people have very strong feelings about him. But if it hadn't been for that interview with Tommy Robinson, I would not have known about this disgrace, how long it went on, and how hard some of these parents had to fight to get their daughters out of the clutches of these men. There was one story where a father found out where his daughter had been taken. He went to the home to get his daughter, his young teenage daughter, out of the house, and the police came and they arrested him. Not the men who were holding his daughter, but they arrested the angry father who went to rescue his daughter. And that was the first time a light bulb went off over my head, and I said, there is something very, very fishy going on here.
that is always, if this was the chief constable, or if it was Rishi Sunak's daughter, or, you know, the daughter of a wealthy individual, would the police still say that that child was making a lifestyle choice? And I would say absolutely not.
Of course not.
But these children, I would say, were the most vulnerable in our country, you know, mostly in On Augusta, those kids were all living in care homes.
There you
And I
go.
use that word care because that's how it's referred to. But those children are not cared for. They don't know love. They're not cared for. Nobody cares about them. And so when an abuser will target a vulnerable child, and they can spot vulnerability easily.
Of course.
They give that child attention. You know, they might take them out in a big car. They might buy them a pizza or a bit of jewelry, food. Those children initially feel important. They think that somebody cares about them. That is exploitation. And these gangs are so sophisticated because the authorities have never addressed it. So, you know, and in the Rochdale case, most of those children were living at home. But for instance, Ruby and Amber, their brother had been abused in the care home that Cyril Smith abused children in.
Right.
And the brother had actually met his abuser in the street. He was working for the post office many years later. And then he took a drug overdose. And Amber actually found him dead on the couch. Mum was great children. So they were like bringing themselves up, and it wasn't that they weren't cared for. They lived in a very difficult situation. And my take on it was, and still is, that the family should have been supported because they weren't bad people. They were just struggling. And the children were left to their own devices. So when somebody turns up and gives them some attention and a little bit of care, the children, you know, a 12-year-old child doesn't see that this is bad. Both of those children now can look back and they know full well, you know, when I'm with Ruby, because they're like my own children in many ways. I've, you know, been alongside them for 10, 12 years. When I talk to Ruby now, I mean, she's got children that are almost the age that she was when she was being raped. And she can't understand now how that could be allowed to happen. I can't understand it. But with Amber, they dropped her as a victim. And I went off the job. I couldn't make any sense of it. I spent about 6 weeks trying to decide what I was going to do. But ultimately, what was happening in the background, we had Hillsborough all over the telly,
Right.
and families that had lost 30 years of their lives trying to fight for the truth to come out.
For non-Brits, it's just that was a disaster at a soccer football stadium where people were crushed, and the police appear to have covered up.
They blamed the families. They said that the victims were drunk and they were fighting, and it was their own fault that they had been squashed to death. And the families never accepted that. And for 30 years, they fought for the truth. And the truth has come out. There were decisions made by police and the authorities where gates were opened, and that caused the stampede. That was all going on the TV back in 2011. And I'm sitting there in a real mess, couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat, I couldn't make sense of, you know, here's a job that I'd given 16 years of my life to, that I thought was about protecting children. There's nothing more important to me. And yet here I am for the second time, seeing senior officers closing down a job where I knew again of dozens of men that were abusing children. And I've got 4 kids of my own, as I said, and I just thought, knowing the kind of person that I am, I always do my best. And I've got a very good sense of right and wrong. This wasn't about being a police officer. This was just so wrong that any decent human being who heard what was going on would think it was wrong. And from police, for senior police officers, chief constables, to decide to close the job down when we had all the evidence we needed, for me was so wrong that if I didn't speak out about it, I was as bad as them. And I didn't want my kids to turn the telly on in 30 years' time when I'm not here and hear all about Rochdale and Operation Augusta and say, well, my mum worked on that. Why did she not say anything? So ultimately, I spoke to the boss on that job, and I told her what I thought was wrong. And she agreed with me. She said, I agree with what you're saying, but I was only a detective. Senior officers make decisions and you do as you're told. And if you can't do that, maybe you're in the wrong job. Now, I'd been struggling about what to do because I felt great loyalty to that officer because she was completely out of her depth. She'd been put on that job to run it. She didn't have a clue. She'd never run a serious investigation. She couldn't open the computer system. She was out of her depth, but she wasn't a bad person. But when she said that to me, I thought, you know what? My loyalties have to be to these children. If you know what is going on and you are not saying anything, then who else is going to? So that was when I made my mind up that I was going to speak out. I was not going to be silenced. And I started about a 15-month journey within the police. I was still a serving police officer, and I went to everybody. I went to the head of public protection. I went to the chief constable, head of serious crime, the Home Office, the IOPC, a lawyer. Nobody wanted to hear what I had to say. The chief constable basically said he wouldn't meet me. I did him a war and peace email, same one I sent to the head of public protection. Just didn't want to know. If lessons have to be learned, we will learn them. Thank you very much for your interest. And the more I wrote to people, the more the penny began to drop.
Mm-hmm.
That whereas initially I thought they didn't know what was going on, I thought that I would shock them. When I said if the public knew what was going on here, the organisation would be brought into disrepute. Do you know? I now know 100% that they all knew. I was the problem because I wouldn't be silenced.
People who tell their truth are always the problem. I know I'm not saying much. Okay. I understand that I'm not commenting that much. What could I possibly have to add to what this woman is saying? This extraordinary, brave woman who is a legend, a remarkable woman who butted heads with every single person in the system in order to do the right thing. Truth tellers are rarely celebrated in their time or while they're telling the truth. They're usually ostracized, gaslighted, demonized, set to the side. It's only in the fullness of time that we can, that the public at large will fully appreciate how brave these people were. Keep in mind that this was a massive cover up on the part of the police, on the part of the political establishment, and on the part of the press. If you could go back and take a look at those headlines, you can Google them and take a look at what the press was writing about, children involved in prostitution. And you can see, you've heard how young these children were. This was not prostitution. These children were being exploited by grown men, some in their 50s and 60s. I just saw on Twitter recently that one of the men who was convicted, who was supposed to be deported 7 years ago, is still in the United Kingdom. He still has not been sent back to Pakistan. And I think that people should be asking why. Why is he still in the country? Why is it so difficult to deport criminals from your midst? It is astonishing.
And the head of serious crime, when I was granted 10, 15 minutes of his time, he told me, I made it very clear that I was not going to be silenced, that if he didn't listen, if the police didn't act, I was going to go public. And he made it very clear that if I went public, you can go to prison. What you
can go to
is
prison.
Confidential. You only know it because you're a serving police officer. It's in writing. And so I was, it terrified me, actually. But I still felt somewhere inside that if I didn't speak, nobody would. And once I'd faced my fear and stepped outside the organization, I was on the outside. I was not going to be silenced. And I resigned in October 2012 and I went public I spent 3 months putting a program together with File on 4. Just before I resigned, though, I was told, I don't know why I was told, but somebody told me in a document that was very confidential. I was made aware that not only had Amber been dropped as a victim, when the barrister who was leading the trial found out exactly what Amber had told me and what she had disclosed, it became very clear that the trial would not go ahead without her evidence. And anybody who understands the criminal justice system will know that in a court of law, in a trial, the only evidence that is admissible is either if you are a victim or a witness, or you are an offender. And so the only way of getting Amber's evidence then into court, because she'd been dropped as a victim and it was too late to bring her back, was to secretly add her onto the indictment as an abuser.
Wow.
So they never told her.
Because of the accusations of her being a madam.
Wow.
Yeah, so they portrayed her wrongly, and the report 2 weeks ago categorically says that that was wrong. I knew it was wrong from day one. Anybody with any ounce of decency would know that was wrong, and that the police and that the Crown Prosecution Service would stoop to those depths secretly. And the reason was and I'm quoting, a tactical option to get her evidence into court, for me is inhumane. It is wicked. It is the worst thing I have ever heard.
Imagine that you are a victim, and the only way that you can testify at a trial about what happened to you is if you are wrongly accused of being a perpetrator. A victim is accused of being a perpetrator. It boggles the mind. And the fact that that woman, Amber, did not lose her mind and is still with us and is now a mother herself, is, I mean, what is the word that you can use to describe such a thing? Once again, I highly, highly recommend that you watch the drama Three Girls. It is powerful. It is excellent. I don't know where you can watch it. I watched it on BBC Player when it first aired on the BBC. It is excellent. So I definitely urge you to find it and watch it, because it tells this story through the eyes of 3 of the victims.
So they secretly added her onto the indictment. They never arrested her. They never cautioned her. They never gave a legal representation. They didn't tell her. And all the evidence that she had shared with me as a victim in video interviews was then used in court to prosecute the abusers, but they added her onto that gang of abusers as one of the conspirators, even though she had been through exactly the same as all the other victims.
You must have felt. How did you feel?
Sick. I still do. Sick to my stomach. And I was obviously I was told I couldn't speak to them.
Right, yeah. So you couldn't even explain
couldn't
it.
even.
So they must have thought you'd betrayed them.
They were told that I'd lost the plot. That they were told they mustn't contact me, and I thought I'd abandoned them. So virtually the day after I resigned, I went back to that family.
Okay, so not only did she tell the truth, not only did she put her career on the line, not only did she leave the police force, not only did she go out and try to get justice, but then, of course, as is inevitable, they tried to smear this lady and say that she was crazy, brand her as a lunatic, as somebody who was paranoid, a conspiracy theorist. This is a strong woman right here.
It was 15 months after I'd spoken to them. They wouldn't let me through the door because they thought I'd used them and I'd dragged them in. But they did let me in, and I explained what had happened. And I also explained to Amber, you were put on the indictment. Bear in mind, this is 6 months after the trial. And she just went white, and her mum. And then the penny dropped, and she said, oh my God, Now it makes sense. She said she just had her first baby, and the baby was a second baby. The first baby she'd had just before I met her. Now she'd got a second baby that had been born about 2-3 weeks before I'd gone back. And when that baby was born, because she'd been named on the indictment as part of the grooming gang as an abuser, before that baby was born, or when the baby was born, social services had turned up at the hospital. And they
Wow.
had tagged the baby, and they wouldn't let her take the baby out of the hospital.
Wow. Wow. So this girl was smeared. She was lied about. And now here comes Child Protective Services. I told you guys, this is an unbelievable story. Now do you see? Now do you understand why people were so angry in the UK? Now do you see why there was a special sense of outrage and venom in places like Rochdale? Now do you understand why people in the UK are so furious at Keir Starmer? Because of this.
3 days later, the matron said, we need the paperwork to keep this baby here any longer. They didn't have any paperwork. It was an unlawful kind of imprisonment of her and a baby. It went to court, and they tried to take her kids away from her.
Of course.
But I went and got lawyers then, and we fought because it was all complete and utter lies. It took a year, but she kept her kids.
A year.
I have no doubt that had I not gone back, they would have taken her kids away from it based on a pack of lies. And I have no doubt that she would have committed suicide. She is a great little mum. And I know I was ashamed of my part in gaining their trust, but I have done everything I could to put it right. And
it wasn't your fault.
It wasn't my
you were
fault.
made complicit without.
It wasn't my fault, but I felt a real sense of responsibility. But I love them. I love them dearly. They're hard work.
You've saved their lives.
Well, they are. They know my kids. I know their children, and we've traveled this journey together. And I have no doubt that without me standing up to be counted, they would have had their lives destroyed. This issue would have been buried because nobody even knew that job had existed. So I lost everything though I resigned from the police. I lost my income. I lost my career. I lost my mental health for a long time. My last day at work, I was unconscious on the floor because I was so ill and I couldn't make sense of it. And I just wanted the truth to be told. So I did a documentary with File on 4, thinking that would be it. The girls actually took part in that documentary, but the subject kind of wouldn't leave me alone. It followed me.
Yeah.
And then the drama team approached me, and I ended up bringing on board everybody to make that drama. I was the program consultant. Then the drama is a drama, kind of doesn't tell the full truth. So I wrote a book because I wanted the facts to be there. Not just a drama. I wanted the facts there. And then I thought I was completely worn out. We were like 8 years after I'd resigned then. And I thought, I can't do this on my own anymore. So I either walk away completely or I try and build a team that can carry on this legacy alongside me and then carry it on when I can't do it anymore. So I started my own charity, which was the Maggie Oliver Foundation. And that was in 2019. We've now helped over 4,000 survivors of abuse, and we are working on cases today with victims who are being failed today.
Wow.
The independent reviews, Andy Burnham, who's the Police and Crime Commissioner and the Mayor of Manchester, heard me spouting on the radio and on the TV after the drama, I'm sure he thought I was telling lies at the time, but he announced that there were going to be an independent review into the Manchester case and the Rochdale case. Both of those have officially concluded that I was telling the truth.
Thank
Every
God.
single word I've said is the truth.
Vindicated.
I'm vindicated. And
Amazing.
more than that, the world knows it's the truth. And
Yes.
although last week there was a press conference when that report was published, and if anybody wants to go on to my, say, Twitter, it's Maggie Oliver UK. I've shared that press conference, and I heard the new chief constable saying, his words were, "As surely as night follows day, this wouldn't happen today."
I don't
Well,
believe
I
that.
stood up and I said, it absolutely is happening today.
That's right.
And I'd been approached in the last month by an officer who is now resigned, who could have been me 10 years ago. So don't come with all that.
Mhm.
This is going on.
Overconfidence every time that they have.
It's just pretending it's in the past. And my argument is, this isn't about the past. And unless you're honest about what is going on, from the foundation, we are taking cases to throughout the whole country. We're a national charity, about police failures, about where victims are being fobbed off, about where they're being criminalized, where they're being arrested and silenced. We are a real voice for change, but it's based on current practices and multiple victims who, I've been saying, because everybody in the UK has seen this drama, Mr. Bates against the post office.
Yes, yeah.
I could be Mr. Bates, because in the foundation, we are pulling together all these voices of isolated victims who are being treated in the same way. We are spotting patterns and failures, and I've got no axe to grind except do your job properly.
Yeah.
Your job is to uphold the law. If
That's
you have a
right.
victim comes to you who has been raped on a daily basis, and I don't just mean grooming gangs, I mean victims of any kind of sexual crime. So violence against women and girls, an individual rape, a young man being abused. We only deal with sexual crime, but so many are getting a horrific service from a system which is completely broken. The complaint system is unfit for purpose. It is not independent.
Well, let me ask you. I've heard quite a lot that it's been said that they didn't want to offend the British Pakistani community.
Yeah.
And that was a big, because I know you mentioned the budgets and things, they didn't want to spend the money on the operations, but do you think that was an issue that they didn't want to offend?
I do think the ethnicity of the offenders, definitely back in 2005. And also when I first started out, I couldn't refer to these abusers as Pakistani Muslim men. I remember going on the Today program with John Humphreys and really pushing the buttons or the boundaries, because it's the truth.
It is the truth.
It is the truth. But as I've said, that was definitely a big part of why the authorities tiptoed around it.
Yeah, they fobbed it off as maintaining social cohesion. That was the weasel phrase that was used. Maintaining social cohesion. What that means in plain English is that they didn't want rioting, and they didn't want these loudmouth community leaders, self-appointed, to come out and start talking about racism in the police and being singled out and so on. 99% of the men who were part of these gangs were Pakistani British Muslims. I'm sorry, the numbers do not lie. Does that mean that every Pakistani man in the UK was involved? Of course it doesn't. And to suggest that would be absurd. However, when you look at the numbers of these gangs, that is ultimately who was part of these grooming gangs. I saw a random, like, North African here and there, but for the most part, it was Pakistani British Muslims. And the sooner that we accept that reality, the better off we will be. There is no utility in spreading lies to avoid hurting people's feelings. It's absurd.
I also believe that it is, as I've said, because these children were seen as an underclass, that
That's
they
right.
didn't matter, that who was going to, challenge the system, who's going to, fight for these kids. And if they did, they're so easy to dismiss.
This is a modern phenomenon whereby, this is just my opinion, but some people on the left have stopped caring about class and helping the working class.
That's
So
right.
they turned a blind eye to that,
Yeah.
and then started caring in an inordinate amount about offending people, even if they might be abusers,
Yeah,
whatever.
Absolutely.
I had Yasmin Mohammed on the show yesterday. She's an ex-Muslim who had a torrid childhood and difficult upbringing. She's fantastic, a wonderful speaker.
Yasmin Mohammed is amazing. Another very, very brave woman. She gave Andrew Gold an interview. As a matter of fact, I'm going to share. I will do that in a second. I'm going to share his channel. I was stupid. I don't think that I included it in the description. But he has done a series of amazing interviews. And if you're ever in the mood to go out, and if you've got a bunch of hours to spare, and you're looking for something to binge, don't binge bullshit. Don't eat junk food. Instead, eat a nice, healthy meal and go over to Andrew Gold's channel and watch some of his spectacular, excellent interviews. I've just put the link in chat. You won't be sorry. His channel is brilliant. So let's continue.
And I told her I was speaking to you, and she knows the case. She's Canadian, but she knows about the case. And she said to say to you, and I'm sure you know as well, like, this is going on in Pakistan. She said this is being brought straight over here.
It has.
And those very men, she's not entirely sure about those particular men who were involved in that case in Rochdale, but often they will start there and they come over, and that's why it's so coordinated.
Yeah. I think there is a culture in the police that turns a blind eye. But I also feel within the Pakistani Muslim community that are involved in this kind of abuse, there is an attitude that the children they're abusing don't matter.
Exactly, that's true.
That they are up for it, that they are, they're not Muslim children, that they are seen as an underclass, and that there is a word for it. They're out and they're even in the trial, in the Rochdale trial, the main abuser was called Shabir Ahmed, or Daddy was his nickname. And even in the trial, he stood up and he blamed the children and the families for letting the children go out at night at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock at night.
There you go.
Well,
Kafir, is that the word?
Yes, it is.
Kafir.
It is that they are now. There are good Pakistani Muslim people, many,
yeah.
What I want to do is generate a conversation as to why does this happen, and without honesty about the fact that it is happening, and that it is so sophisticated now that the networks are really well developed. The children might be picked up in Rochdale, but they will be taken to Rotherham or Huddersfield or Birmingham.
That's right. They're trafficked. The girls were trafficked. They were trafficked all over the country. So it wasn't just a question of grooming. It was a question of human trafficking. And how, again, maybe I'm just incredibly naive. Maybe there's still a shred of naivete left in this rapidly aging body, right? But I still find it incredible that the police could turn away from 12 and 13-year-olds and 11-year-olds and, older teenage girls getting roped in to this horrendous nightmare, seeing that young girls were getting pregnant and having children with these men, the children being the results of rape. And there's some horrific stories about what happened to some of these babies, which I won't get into right now. But the fact that the police would not take it seriously, that they would dismiss it out of hand, an entire category of victims, again, working class girls and Sikh and Hindu girls as well, but mostly the dismissal of these young white working class girls who were considered to be trash, who were asking for it, and who, if they had minded their P's and Q's and stayed home like good girls, they wouldn't have gotten into this mess. That is not the point. The victim blaming in this scandal went on for decades. Decades. This is not a one off, this is not a blip. It went on for decades. The cover up occurred all over the country.
Or it's all around the country.
I just said that.
Why is that? And I would like to see the community itself begin to speak out very vocally that this is not acceptable. I mean, I'm no expert in religion. I'm not religious myself, but I do know that the Quran, depending on who you speak to, doesn't condone this. But others will say that it does. We are a multicultural country.
I hate to break it to you, but it does. That's exactly how ISIS got away with enslaving and raping and torturing Yazidi girls, burning them alive if they wouldn't convert to Islam, starving them to death if they wouldn't convert to Islam. I saw a story about a young Yazidi boy who was told that he could either starve to death or they wanted him to strap a bomb to himself and go and blow up his neighbors. And he refused. But the atrocities that were committed against the Yazidis were incredible. And even to this day, the girl who won the Nobel Prize, the Yazidi girl who won the Nobel Peace Prize, is still not welcome to speak at a number of universities and a number of official gatherings because what she has to say is considered to be Islamophobic. Imagine not allowing a survivor of such a horrific event not to speak because you don't want to offend certain people. It's amazing. Let's continue.
And what, for me, it's very simple. If anybody comes to this country, they're entitled to their own religion, but they are not entitled to bring things that they may get away with in other countries to this country.
Right.
We all abide by the same laws
Well,
in
we're
the UK.
supposed to.
And harsh as it might sound, if you're not prepared to do that, you don't live here. If I go to a different country, I have to respect their laws and their rules. You know, I know I spend quite a lot of time in Turkey and they have different rules than we do here, but I would never expect to override their laws by taking what I have to, what I believe from here.
I saw a stat saying that although British Asians, and that's the word they've used, unfortunately, and you've pointed out why that's not right. They
always do.
Pakistani Muslims.
Yeah.
But it's, British Asians make up 7% of the population, but 87% of convictions involving child exploitation involved British Asians.
87%.
But they said, this was a commissioner report, you probably actually saw this at the time, to dwell on this data would be irresponsible.
Would it?
And I categorically deny with that, disagree with that. I would say that figure that you've said is actually double what it should be, because half of those people in that percentage are women.
British Asian. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you would halve that.
So 3% of the population are British Asian men.
Yes. Mm-hmm. And they are responsible.
87%.
At least 87%, because I know there was an organisation, the Quilliam Foundation, I think it was. But those you have to halve those.
Wow.
And the authorities have never collected ethnicity of the offenders. And in the foundation, we now do. We're not a national statistical authority, but I would argue that the statistics are not collected because they would very clearly prove what you've just said.
That's right.
What I would say, and I always say it, that the vast majority of people in this country are white British people. And I am not saying, and a great deal of the abuse in this country is carried out often within the family, But if you look at this particular kind of crime, which hasn't been addressed properly by the authorities, it is indisputable, in my opinion, that that is the makeup of the offenders. And I want to see a national conversation about it, an honest one. And I want to know reasons why we don't address it. And we have to.
You know what it reminds me of? I don't know if you were aware of at the time, or maybe you were on this particular thing, but there was a Channel 4 documentary about 20 years ago that looked into the mosques around Britain and the hate speech, basically calling for the deaths of Jews and homosexuals and anyone who was kafir, that kind of thing, calling very aggressively for that, which is, I believe, illegal, that kind of trying to rally people up to murder others. And when that was brought to the attention of the police, I think, tried to sue Channel 4, or at least would criticize Channel 4 for releasing the documentary because they said it would interfere with relations in the community.
I wonder if when I started out on this journey in 2004, it might be the same documentary you're talking about, but there was a documentary on Channel 4. It was part of the Dispatches program.
Right.
And it was called Edge of the City. And a documentary team were shadowing a social services team in Keighley in South Yorkshire. And as part of that, it was for many months. And as part of that documentary, they discovered this particular problem, that the community had been fighting to have this addressed by the police. Anne Clara was the MP for Keighley. She brought it up in Parliament, and nobody wanted to hear about it. Now, when I joined Operation Augusta in 2004, I now believe, well, I know the reason that investigation was put together was because we had a little girl called Victoria Agolia, who had been horrendously sexually exploited and abused in Rochdale. And she was given a drugs overdose by one of her main abusers. At exactly the time that death occurred, that documentary, Edge of the City, was due to go out, to be transmitted. And it was also when the elections were going on. And so the police, I think it was the police, applied to have that episode held back because they feared it would cause racial tension and riots. So that episode was held back, or that program was held back. Victoria died, who had been through exactly what the children in Keighley were going through. I know that Greater Manchester Police feared that there would be an outcry when this program went out. That's why they put together Operation Augusta. I was asked to go on that job. There were only 3 of us to start with, and it grew into a bigger job. But when the program was finally transmitted and there wasn't a national outcry, they thought, why are we going to take this job any further? So they buried that job. They forgot about all the children. They allowed 100 abusers to continue to abuse and pretended that job had never happened. Now Greater Manchester Police in 2020 have been forced to reopen that case, but it's 20 years too late. Yeah. So those reasons that you're saying, I have no doubt at all, were the thinking behind, I always call it willful blindness. They knew what was going on. They chose to do nothing for the reasons you said, but also why put money into these cases when we really don't want to know what's going on? Let's pretend it doesn't happen. But the losers were the kids.
Yeah.
And the men that were abusing still were allowed to continue to abuse for 15 years. God knows how many other kids they abused. So we need a national conversation. Also in 2008, I am told, it was actually the former chief prosecutor who said that in 2008, the government sent a circular around to all the CPS offices saying that these kind of crimes must not be investigated by the police. So there are all these reasons threading into it. So for me to be heard has been the biggest battle of my life. I was speaking the truth, and now I think that truth is accepted throughout the country, to the point that people don't really talk about it anymore because people know that is the truth.
Are there right now, in and around Britain, British Pakistani gangs exploiting children?
Absolutely.
Of course there are.
100%. But what I want to make very clear is that for me, this issue has moved way beyond just the grooming gangs. For me, this is about systemic failures within the police,
Yep.
within the criminal justice system, which is on its knees. It is a lack of victim care. It is blaming victims and silencing them, whoever their abusers are. I mean, there's going to be another review coming out in probably within the next 6 weeks, in relation to victims who have been unlawfully, inhumanely strip searched in police custody.
Yes.
They're being, I call them punishment strip searches, because we are supporting 4 of those victims, now 8 that we've identified. All of them have dared to challenge Greater Manchester Police in the way they've been treated.
I spoke with one of them. I can't think of her name, but she was sort of almost
Zaina.
Yes.
Yes. Well,
She was like knocked out and then woke up and
that's right.
found
She's one of them.
Stripped.
So Zaina's one of the girls who, I mean, she's a very strong character herself, but she came to the foundation. I know Zaina. She's one of, I think there's 13, but Zaina was one victim. Within the foundation, we spotted a pattern. And so we actually took it to Sky, and Sky did a really good, thorough piece covering 4 of those victims, that we are fighting for 3 of them. Zaina's kind of fighting her own battle, but she's still, we were messaging last week, but many victims don't feel strong enough to take the system on. And I say about the post office drama, you know, each one of those victims, the postmasters who were sent to prison or criminalized, as an individual, their voice becomes buried. They are very easy to be dismissed. But once you go from 1 to 2 to 10 to 20, suddenly this isn't a mistake. It isn't one victim who is, you know, easy to blame. It becomes an example of a pattern of behavior. And that's the value of the Maggie Oliver Foundation, that we are able to plot the patterns. So I would say an unlawful use of strip searching as a means of silencing victims who are challenging a system that doesn't want to be challenged, abuse of power within that system, absolutely no independent scrutiny of those actions of police forces, because when a victim complains to the police, it is investigated by their own professional standards department.
Yeah, exactly. The what their equivalent of the internal affairs. I've been having a great many conversations with people recently about police work, lazy policing, indifferent policing, police officers who don't seem to know what the hell their job actually entails, and how public safety doesn't seem to be a big priority with a lot of these people. And we're seeing this conversation take place now in the UK because of these outrageous arrests that have taken place as a result of the recent instability in the UK following the stabbings of those girls in Southport, and the general sense of the British public that something is very wrong, that there had been, I mean, look, people live their lives. Okay, you get up, you go to work, you take care of your kids, you go to school, you do whatever you do, and you read about the grooming gangs, you read about that scandal. However, you assume, because you don't hear about it anymore, or it goes on the back burner, that it's all been settled, you know, that there have been reforms put in place, that we won't allow this to happen again, that this is going to be taken seriously. And so you just kind of go on your merry way. That is human nature. We can only fixate on so many issues at one time. All right. And if you have a full life and you're not sitting around obsessing about 1 or 2 issues all the time, and I say that in terms of obsessing over issues that aren't really that important, and you kind of lose sight of certain stories because you're on Twitter a lot, and the news changes every second on Twitter. Uh, News trends and news fades away, and so you kind of think, all right, well, I'm assuming that all of those terrible men went to prison, and that the really bad ones were deported, and now the problem has been solved. The problem has not been solved, because now what we're also saying is people being arrested for meany words that they post on the internet. And this has been a growing trend in the UK. It is extremely dangerous, and it is very, very frightening. But again, the UK does not have a First Amendment. The UK, and I would also say the United States, are headed to are headed in a very bad direction, to a very, very bad place indeed. There is only so much more that the British public can take in terms of the gaslighting, being lied to, the two-tier policing, politicians not listening to them, the police not protecting them, um, newcomers in the country, many of them illegal, being given a hands up, being given assistance over people who were born in that country, who are struggling. I'm telling you, this is all going to end very, very, very badly. Very badly. So let's wrap this up. 8 minutes left.
And even when they take it to the next level and go to the Independent Office for Police Conduct, they are not independent, and they don't see that complaint. The form goes online, addressed to the IOPC, but they don't open it. It goes straight back to the professional standards within the police force against who the complaint is. And it's only when that police force voluntarily refers it to the IOPC that the IOPC ever see it. So I'm looking to change a system. If you had a system that worked, somebody like Amber or Ruby who complained would have somebody independent looking at their case and maybe would think this isn't right. But when you're complaining to an organization that has caused that problem, they do not want to see that they are corrupt or that they are acting unlawfully. And they cover up the system in exactly the same way as the post office covered up. It's power in the hands of those who are under investigation. It's an abuse of power.
I will be covering the post office scandal in the UK. It doesn't sound very interesting, does it? It sounds a bit dull. It sounds a bit nerdy. It sounds like something you're probably not going to be interested in. Believe me when I tell you, you will be interested in the British post office scandal. It was outrageous. And the people who got hemmed up in that scandal are only now getting a fair hearing, and only now facing the possibility of getting justice. Again, a scandal that has been going on for years, where people were falsely accused of, I want to remember the exact words, not just stealing, but actual like embezzlement and wrongdoing, and people were screwed completely screwed over. The woman who oversaw the mess ended up getting some sort of an honor, and everybody else got fucked. And only now are they facing the possibility of getting justice at long last.
So I started this journey being horrified by the treatment. It was actually Amber that brought it to a head for me, and then Ruby. And the more I've traveled along this path, the more my eyes have been opened to the fact it wasn't one lazy officer, and it wasn't one case that wasn't handled properly.
Mhm.
And it actually wasn't just about the ethnicity of offenders or the social class of the victims. It is a system that needs to be fit for purpose. And if there is something going wrong, we need to have somewhere to go to expose what's going wrong, because I had nowhere to go. I was telling the truth. I tried desperately to be heard. And yet, where could I go? I went within the organization trying to get a chief constable to listen to me. And you know what he said? When I went public, he went on national TV and radio. He knew what I was saying was true. And yet he said I was a woman who became too emotionally involved. I had
Amazing.
been bereaved. I had lost the plot. He'd met me on many occasions. To this day, he's never met me once. But I had nowhere to go. He was a liar. His name was Peter Fye. He is now Sir Peter Fye.
Of course
And
he
he's
is.
a victim's advocate in the media. And I'm sorry, he should be in prison.
Good for you,
The
ladies.
chief prosecutor, Nazir Afzal, he's the one who decided to drop Amber as a victim and then authorized her to be added onto the indictment as well.
That is probably one of the most heartbreaking revelations. Nazir Afzal was always a hero of mine, and I always thought that Nazir Afzal was the head of the Crown Prosecution Service. I thought that he took the lead in trying to get these men prosecuted, and now it turns out that, I wish I didn't know that, but I'm glad I do now.
One of the offenders. For me, he was complicit in that behavior.
He's got, forgive me for saying it, he's got an unfortunate sounding name to be dealing with child exploitation. Peter Fye. Peter Fye?
Peter Fye.
Sounds like Peter.
Oh, I never thought of that,
Yeah,
possibly.
unfortunately.
I've heard him on the radio. I get really triggered by this.
I bet. Well, he's
it-
lied about you.
But it's not just about me. I mean, I hear him on the radio saying that he's a good Christian. He's got 3 daughters of his own. And I think, what about all these children? In your hands was their welfare. And you were in a position of power. You were the chief constable and you turned away from them. And now you're pretending to care about victims. Well, I'm sorry. If you cared about victims, you would not have allowed this to happen on your watch. You would have stood up and been counted alongside me, and you weren't. So I get really angry when somebody like that is made, is knighted. He should be in prison. And actually, Nazir Afzal, they're on the media, on BBC, everywhere all the time, talking about the rights of victims. Well, I'm sorry, they're hypocrites. When they were in a position where they could have done something, they did nothing. Instead, it was shoot the messenger. I was the messenger. I was telling the truth, and I tried my absolute best. I went to him begging and pleading for him to do something about these kids, and he turned away. And for me, that is unforgivable. And I've got over it. It strengthened me. I'm a lot different than I was. It's changed me forever. But I call a spade now. I don't like conflict. I never have. But I became the voice of those who had no voice.
How can people help now? Go to the Maggie Oliver Foundation.
Go to our website, themaggieoliverfoundation.com. If they're doing, yes, please. If they're looking for a charity to support, we exist purely on public donations and trust funding. We get not a penny from the state, because I want to be able to speak the truth, not have it connected to, saying the right thing, or we're not going to give you your funding. If we fall apart and we're not able to operate anymore, then so be it. But now I've gone from me, I've got 5 members of staff, 30 volunteer ambassadors. We've got 40 people in our team now.
Amazing.
God bless. I'm going to cut it off here. There's like 2 minutes left. God bless stubborn, tenacious women who are willing to drive themselves to a nervous breakdown. This woman lost everything. She lost her job. She nearly lost her sanity. She was smeared. She was dragged. People who worked with her went public and said that she had gone crazy. But she told the truth. She told the truth. She went up against that entire machine, and look at her. Maggie Oliver, you are a remarkable, remarkable woman. I hate to use this corny word, but you are a shero. And God bless anyone who comes forward and tells the truth, though the heavens may fall, right? So anyway, I really, really appreciate everybody being here. Thank you to all the new subscribers. And thank you to this wonderful chat. Thank you for turning out for Negs' stream, and thank you for turning out for mine. I don't know what I'm doing tomorrow. I'm sure I'll dig something up. But it's great being back, and I'm glad that you guys are here to help us along with this. I appreciate it. Thank you all again, and I will see you guys the next time. And don't forget to sub and like on your way out, and please do share the channel and encourage people to subscribe. See you later.